Good afternoon, London. Welcome to the Andrew Lawton Show here on AM 980. You're listening to London's breaking news leader, Canada's most irreverent talk show, and moreover, just a fantastic time to be had by all here. Thank you so much for coming on the program. All of you who are tuned in, we've got a lot of great stuff coming up ahead still. In about an hour, we're going to be chatting about a British Columbia teacher who was fired after telling students that he was opposed to abortion during a discussion about, shockingly, morality and ethics. We'll also talk later on in the program about the Ontario government's decision to ban cheese sellers, cheesemongers, from doing so without refrigeration, even for products that don't need it. A cheesy topic, albeit, but one that I hope will be Gouda all around, and I'm getting them out of my system. I apologize to all of you who had to bear through those. But I want to talk right now about a group that I've been long a fan of here, and they've had a 50-year run in Canada coming up in a little while with a 50th anniversary, and it is the National Citizens Coalition, a group that has done a great deal of advocacy on issues that are very near and dear to my heart, namely keeping government small, keeping its powers limited, and keeping taxes low. There have been, over the course of the last 5 decades, some major political fights that the NCC has won or very much contributed to the victory of here. And I wanted to talk about this and moreover the context of what a group like that does when, in a lot of ways, what a conservative looks like has changed over the course of that time and continues to do so. I wanted to welcome to the program Peter Coleman, who's the president of the National Citizens Coalition. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the show. Great to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and congratulations on your recent marriage.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations on your organization's 50 years. We'll have good wishes all around today.
Thank you.
Let's talk first off about really the core mandate of NCC, because one thing that's interesting, and I saw actually an ad that the NCC ran in the Globe and Mail 50 years ago, and what's funny is that the core focus hasn't changed, which is very incredible for an organization with that much longevity.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now we've got Trudeau 2.0. When Colin Brown's dad started the organization in 1967, he was alarmed by some of the universality of different programs and government spending here, government spending there, and things were out of control. So he took an ad out in the paper in the Globe and Mail, and it got so bad, Andrew, that the post office fellow in London said, get your own post office box. So many people responded back saying, because he tapped into a theme that people were tired of, big government and governments telling them what to do and how to behave and where they're going to spend and waste money. And it's amazing 50 years from then to now, it's the same thing over again with Trudeau's son.
In a lot of ways, though, do you find that disconcerting? Because here we have an organization that's been fighting on this, and even after 50 years, you're still having to deal with the same problems and literally the same family that's causing many of them in Ottawa.
You know what? You go through a cycle where you think you have some wins, Andrew, and there's days you kind of get frustrated, but you have to keep on educating the next generation, because I think the younger generation, who's predisposed in a large measure to younger Trudeau, don't realize what's happening with $35 billion deficits and what's going to happen down the road and how it will impact services they might want. And the old saying for the younger generation is they're all NDP voters until they start making a paycheck, and then they start to question what's going on. I think over time it's going to happen here too, because Trudeau is extremely popular right now, and he'll be around for a while, it seems. But the bloom will come off the rose eventually with him if he doesn't start dealing with the economy and jobs and things like that. And you can look at Brexit and Trump to see examples of people being tired with elitist politicians telling them what to do.
When we look at some of the big campaigns that the NCC has taken on, one of the big ones that jumps out, and obviously it took a long time, but eventually there was success on this, was the Canadian Wheat Board monopoly. We have obviously closed shop unions. We have some of the pension plans and salary packages for MPs, government waste in general. What has been, one of the biggest successes or at least the biggest feathers in the cap for your organization?
I think, Andrew, one of the things that was fascinating, you talked about the Canadian Wheat Board, that was about a 20-year fight, and sometimes our membership will say you're not getting much accomplished, but sometimes these fights take a long time, and all we were saying there was, farmers out west should have a choice to sell their crops to whoever they wanted to, and it was a Wheat Board monopoly. And what's proven now, it was a big fight with all the brass at the Wheat Board, what's proven now 2 years out from people giving choice, and some stayed with the Wheat Board and some didn't, but the ones that decide to market their own crops are getting record prices. They have more control over selling their own private property. And all we were trying to say was, this is Canada. In Eastern Canada, you can do what you want. So in Western Canada, we were pushing for this to happen. But it took 20 years and many levels of government to happen to get through that. So that was one of the biggest achievements, through just because of the longevity of it, Andrew.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a really important one, because a lot of people would give up the fight and move on to the next thing. And you have a lot of groups where, they focus on the outrage of the day or whatnot. And I think there's a place for that, obviously. I work in talk radio where we need to respond to things as they're happening. But there also is a profound level of significance in playing the long game in a lot of these things, when you recognize that something that is so ingrained in a culture or collective conscience or memory, whatever the case may be, is going to be that much more difficult to chip away at. And I think that's especially true with a lot of the big political battles we see today, where you're talking about with younger voters things that they never knew a world without. For example, if you were to talk about healthcare, if you were to talk about all of these other areas where it's very difficult to impact change on something that people think is so innately part of Canada.
Yeah, and the healthcare is a great example too, because around the world there's systems where people have choices. There's private options in the public healthcare system, and everybody says that the healthcare system in Canada is a sacred cow. And as Dr. Schumacher was an OMA and CMA president said, if it was such a sacred cow, why do we spend $2 billion a year, people going to the States to get healthcare taken care of somewhere else, and when we won't offer it here? And countries that are much more socialist than we are, like France, already have parallel systems in healthcare. And part of what we try and do, Andrew, is educate people as to what's going on. We are a small C conservative organization, no question about that, but part of it's education for the younger generation, especially saying, we're fighting this fight for you because you're going to pay down the road when you haven't got choice in your health care. In Ontario, you've got a $300 billion plus deficit. You've got $11 billion in interest costs every year, which causes problems as far as having money for health care and other areas. So sometimes people can think that these issues aren't all attached together, but when you have really incompetent governments like the Wynne government in Ontario, everybody suffers greatly.
When you talk about that small C conservative identity, this is something that I've always had to explain to people as well, when they think that conservatism automatically means a complete lockstep formation with the Conservative Party or the Progressive Conservative Party. And I think you and I both know that there are a lot of times when the small C conservative position is not necessarily being represented by any party, let alone the big C party. But have you found that's been a challenge in the time that you've been president of the organization or involved in the organization, or even looking at the history of it, is really people conflating ideological conservative versus political partisan conservative?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point for sure, because I think people, we say that, we like to keep taxes responsible and government waste to as low as you can, because governments don't do much very well because politics gets in the way. They have to win a new election. They got to win a riding. They tend to spend money very inefficiently. The government, private sector unions, it's impossible to get fired from there. Their staffing is way too high. And all these things come back to, the end of the day, as pocketbook issues. I mean, as much as, you try and hope that stuff will get resolved, when you see things coming forward now with carbon taxes and different taxes, at the end of the day, it's all money coming out of your pocket. And you got to say, is this the best value for our money as taxpayers? Because governments don't care, by and large, about spending money. And Trudeau's proven that. He inherited a budget surplus. Now he's $35 billion in deficit the first year, and I don't think Canadians are better off. But there's going to be a cost for those expenditures down the road, and people need to be aware of that.
Well, and that's one of the most important things, is that oftentimes, especially when we look at liberal policies and the things that the NDP tries to push for, we see a profound disconnect between the impact that something will have a generation later, or even, 5-10 years later. If you look at its addition to the debt, its addition on really downloading debt and deficit spending to next generations.
Yeah, it's true, and we're going to see this again with everybody's certainly for Trudeau. You would think the only issue that matters to Canada is saving the world from climate change, and it's frustrating because if you ask the average person, they would not know that Canada's less than 2% of the world's greenhouse gases, that the oil sands are 5% of that, and it means that 1/10 or 1% of the world's greenhouse gases are caused by the oil sands. And they're going to pose a carbon tax. It's all it's going to do is increase the prices of products for everybody. It's not going to help save the environment. It won't make Trudeau look like the super green person he wants to be. And there's a cost for all those taxes. And as much as I believe in helping out the environment, and I do that, these taxes do nothing to reduce our greenhouse gases or improve the climate at all.
When you look at the founders of the NCC, do you ever think they would be handed as much of a gift as our Prime Minister now, again a Trudeau, lauding Fidel Castro on the day of his passing? I know this is something that, if we had late night comedy in Canada, the jokes just write themselves.
Yeah, they do for sure. And what's staggering for me is, and I know that Trudeau has an intense amount of personal popularity, and we'll see where that thing shakes out down the road. But it is incredibly naive. But that's what he grew up with. I mean, he's never had a job in his life. He's never balanced a book. I mean, and you can say it about Harper too. But one thing Harper didn't do for most people, he didn't embarrass on the international stage, and he was actually a guy that you actually respected in some regards as having some fiscal sense of sanity. Trudeau has none of that, and they're trying to keep him out of the House of Commons because he's embarrassing in question period as far as answering questions. So they put him on the road, and he does this stuff about Castro, which was appalling. And then even when he realized he was probably wrong, Andrew, he barely even backtracked to say, this guy was really not a very nice person to people in Cuba, and he kept on the same theme.
It's laughable, except it also makes you want to cry at the same time. I mean, it's difficult because you shake your head wondering, is this reality? Is this actually happening?
Yeah, you know what, and I'm a bit of a cynic. As a Canadian person, you want the Prime Minister to do well, but there's no doubt in my mind he's Prime Minister because his last name is Trudeau. He never would have been Prime Minister and gotten where he got to without it. And I hope he does some things that will actually make people proud on the international stage. I'm not holding my breath, but everything he does seems to be in this narrow green piece kind of prism of what's going on. But at the end of the day, you've got to balance the environmental issues with people actually having jobs and doing something. And it just frustrates me because I don't get any sense from him that he's anything more than a puppet right now. Whenever he starts talking off the script, he's terrible. He's not good on his feet, and I hope that's just immaturity in the job and he grows into it. But I think we're in for a pretty rough ride with Trudeau.
You mentioned Stephen Harper a couple of moments ago, and this is an interesting one because he's really long before becoming Prime Minister. Well, not long before Prime Minister, but about a decade before Prime Minister was actually the head of the NCC himself. He was before that a vice president after he was an MP, and then he had left, did the NCC work, went back to politics and public life. What was the feeling going back then? Because I know that you have been the head of the NCC, as I understand it, or at least had a very large role since we had a Conservative government in Canada. So what was the sentiment in your organization when you had one of your own, quite literally, elevated to that level in Canada?
You referenced earlier about how Colin Sr. would feel today. He'd be extremely proud that Prime Minister Harper came out of working for the National Citizens Coalition. And for those that don't remember, Harper was tired of partisan politics. So he came back to work for our organization. He had young kids. Ben and Rachel were quite young at the time, and he didn't really want to get back into it. And it was fascinating to watch Stephen when he got to the challenge to go back to Unite the Right, but before to lead the Alliance Party and the Reform Party and all the stuff that went on with that and with Peter MacKay. It was amazing to see his determination to go. And I remember a conversation with him before he came Prime Minister in 2005 around Christmas time. And back then, if people remember, Paul Martin was supposed to win a majority of 200 and some odd seats and whatever, and Harper knew that if he lost that election in a bad way, he was probably done as a politician, and he kept Martin to minority government and kept on pushing. That's one thing I admired about Harper. He's not perfect, none of us are, but when he put his head down, he was determined to get something done, and by and large did a good job, and 10 years was a heck of a run for him.
When you look at the last 50 years and the next 50 years, I mean, what are the big fights today?
I think the education process is still there. I think we're living in a very changed environment where things are moving along very quickly with technology and everything. And I think the challenge is to get the younger generation engaged to see what's going on as far as jobs and opportunities when you live in a global environment. And I think you can see with what's happening with the unrest in the States and what's happened in Europe and all these different elections where all these, the United Nations and all these EU groups are telling us what they think their view of the world is when they don't have even a clue what the reality is. And I think that's part of the challenge going forward in a global environment where we live in a fantastic country. And there's no doubt about that. No matter who's the Prime Minister, I think we're blessed to be Canadians when you see what's going on around the world. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we should be able to criticize politicians for the challenges that are going forward. And the young generation's got to take the baton and eventually realize that there's things that are critical to them and not supporting Trudeau because he's young and sexy and new and focusing more on what reality is and what policies and how they affect them individually.
Well, certainly a fascinating legacy, very exciting things afoot. There is perhaps, I think, a little bit of an attitude that the right had in Canada of feeling very defeated after the election. But I think one thing we've seen is that that's also something that should be a call to action for people, saying, okay, now we understand how important it is to fight for these things that we know are important.
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think you're very right. I think people, but after the first year, they sort of seen Trudeau and see where he would go, and I think the bloom isn't off the rose. His polling numbers are still very high, but I think, as you said, things with Castro and some of the mistakes he's going to inevitably make down the road. I think that people are going to realize that, coming back, there's got to be a balance between the environment and sound fiscal policies. And it actually is scary for me in some ways, Andrew, because Bill Morneau, as the finance minister, was the chairman of CD Howe, and you listen to what comes out of his mouth compared to when Jim Flaherty was finance minister. It's shocking how inept he sounds compared to Flaherty, who actually dearly cared about the middle class. I don't get that sense with the Liberals now whatsoever.
Yeah, very much agree with that assessment here. Want to thank you very much, Peter Coleman, president of the National Citizens Coalition, for coming on. Congrats on 50 years, and thanks so much for coming on the show to talk a bit about some of the big battles for your group now.
Thanks. Have a Merry Christmas. Thanks for having me on, Andrew.
Yeah, you too, Peter. All the best to you, sir. We've got to take a break. When we come back in just a couple of moments, looking at the right now, where it has been, where it needs to go. You're listening to The Andrew Lawton Show on AM 980.